Hello and welcome to the first episode of White Dove Works. I'm Adrian and today I'm going to show you how I made a marking gauge. First I'm going to start by laying out some measurements. I'm using my old marking gauge here, which uses a nail. Nails are okay as long as you don't go cross grain. This is why I wanted to make a new marking gauge with a knife. Now I'm cutting my piece of walnut to rough dimensions using my Ryobi saw. Here I'm using my homemade hand plane, which is the only hand plane I have, to square it up. You can really see the difference between the walnut, which is already oiled and waxed from the hand plane, and the rough piece of walnut that I'm working with. Now I'm using my homemade dry square to check if it's square, and fortunately it is. And again, laying out some measurements. So this technical drawing was generated by SolidWorks. Before I started the project, I modeled it as a 3D model to try out some different measurements and different design ideas. And then I generated a technical drawing from this 3D model and took it to the workshop. Then I took a 20mm Forstner bit to drill the hole, and then I squared up the top side of the hole to give it a U-shape. A U-shape is extremely useful for marking gauges because it limits the degrees of freedom to just one, while also making sure that the force that is provided by the screw transfers into different directions, which really results in zero play for the beam. Now I'm cleaning up the U-shaped hole. It doesn't have to be super clean since these walls will not be exposed. I wanted to have some crisp edges. Now I'm transferring the marks for my wear strips, because I'm going to inlay some brass wear strips, and these will need a rabbet so that they are flush with the surface of the walnut. And I created a tiny knife wall, and then I chisel it out to get a groove that will guide my saw blade. And then I will use a fine back saw to create sort of a curving, which gives me a very straight and pristine edge. And I take a chisel and just remove the material about 2mm. And I did that on the top side and on the bottom side, and here you can see the result. There are two rabbets and a strip of walnut left proud in the middle. I'm using the same technique to create some very straight walls for the brass beam that I will inlay on the top side. I will have to remove a lot of material here, so I clamp it to my bench and then just take a chisel and chisel it all out. I really love the smell of walnut every time I work with it. So intense. Test fit. Looks good. Just a little bit more. Now I cut off the excess wood, and here I test fit the brass wire strips. Unfortunately, they are flush, so it's time to glue them in. I'm using some 5-minute epoxy, nothing special. You can see that I also already glued the top beam in there. And now, after I positioned the two strips, I packed the whole thing in painter's tape to make sure that no glue that might be squeezed out will drip on the top of my workbench. While it dries, it's time to do our thumb screw. Here I'm using a 25mm brass rod, just cutting a piece off, which will be the top part of a thumb screw. Then I will drill a hole in there and thread the hole, and then I will screw another brass rod that is also threaded into this hole and tighten it with a counter nut. And this whole thing will then be clamped into my drill press, and I use the drill press as sort of a tiny vertical lathe to finish off the grip part of the thumb screw. You can see it here, using a fine file and then some sandpaper and then some steel wool later on to polish it, to finish it up. And this is what the finished screw looks like. I'm pretty happy. Time to go back to the body of the marking gauge. So it looks very messy. The glue is dried. And now it's time to clean off all the edges and to give it the final shape. First I drilled 4 holes, and then I countersunk them and drilled some screws in there to make sure that these wire strips are going nowhere, because I don't really trust the connection of brass and wood and epoxy, especially not if I put a vertical force onto the brass parts when I file them down. Now was a lot of filing. Of course I could have used a belt sander, but I wanted to keep this as a 100% hand tools project, apart from using the drill press for the screw. Now it's roughly shaped and it's time to drill the hole for the thumb screw. This hole will later then be threaded. You can see I also put some screws in there to secure the beam. Now there's one problem with marking gauges that use screws for tightening, and this is that you always have this sort of drilling motion and a lot of pressure on a very small surface area transferred onto the beam, which will result in extreme damage after just a few times of usage. So I came up with a small brass block inserted into the body of the marking gauge to prevent that, and only put a linear motion onto the beam and transfer the pressure from the screw. I didn't film how I made this block, but you will see it later when the marking gauge is assembled. Now I realized that my thumb screw is a little bit slippery, and I wanted to get rid of that by giving it some texture, using a chainsaw file and just filing some tiny grooves in there. I did 3 grooves at every quarter, and this is the result that I got. Now it's time to finally make the beam. Again, I use my old marking gauge here, which does a great job. And if you want to build one of these simpler marking gauges, head over to Rex Kruger. He has a great video, and it is the same design as mentioned in this one video. Now sawing it to rough dimensions, again using the Ryobi saw. You can see I'm using a tiny, very bad up metalworking vise. I don't have one of these fancy leg vices, tail vices, whatever. Maybe I will build one of these when I build a workbench, but right now it's all I got and it works for me. And then it's time to plane it and square it up. Get rid of all these saw marks. And I always love this sound of a plane taking off shavings. Music to my ears. Now it's time to round the profile to make it fit the U shape that I have on the body. Just by taking off thin shavings and trying to get a radius on there. Now it's time for fine shaping so that it will fit the hole in my marking gauge. Test fit, still too thick. Taking off some shavings again, a little bit of sanding. Here we go. It's super tight, no play. Now here you can see the brass block I talked about earlier. It has a tiny hole in it where the screw goes into, but it can freely rotate within this hole. It is not threaded. And then I can tighten it and there's only linear pressure. No drilling. And also a very large surface area to transfer the pressure. Now it's time to finally make a hole that will hold the blade. I didn't show how I made the blade. I will do a video on that, on making small blades for marking knives and marking gauges in the future. But I used a old circular saw blade and just cut it out. There are many different concepts for securing a blade in a marking gauge, but I didn't want to go for a screw, so I decided to use the old traditional wedge design, which was sort of a challenge for me, and it didn't came out super clean, but it works, it's tight, the blade doesn't move anywhere, so it's fine for me. Time for the final step, maybe the favorite one of all woodworkers ever, oiling. Unfortunately, this camera angle doesn't really show how well the wood reacted to the oil, maybe because of the lighting, I'm not sure. But I always enjoy it. And you can see on the bottom of the body of the marking blade, of the marking gauge, I put my name on there with some stamping letters. I always do that on my tools. And now it's time for a final presentation. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching this build, and if you did, I would be very, very grateful if you consider following me, giving me a thumbs up, and see you next time.